When embarking on the spiritual journey, the first question one should ask oneself is, what is my motivation for practicing the path? And in order to clarify one's intentions, it is helpful to first understand one's basic worldview. But instead, often what we do is to artificially adopt a view or an ideology that is fundamentally at odds with our own natural way of thinking. For example, these days, many Westerners are attracted to the view of non-duality. And I've spoken on this topic many times in previous videos. And although, on the outside, non-duality appears to be in harmony with their own system of beliefs, this illusion of compatibility is based on a mistaken interpretation of non-duality that accords with their own escapist and nihilistic tendencies. And this is how one becomes a non-dual zombie. And I have commented on this phenomena in a previous video, so you can watch that if you are interested in this topic. Now, the baseline view is essentially the same for all sentient beings, inasmuch as no one wishes to suffer, and likewise, every being is seeking happiness and well-being. That notwithstanding, ancillary to this basic motivation, each individual has their own specific set of aims and objectives that they wish to achieve in this or future lifetimes. For worldly people, then most are concerned with financial stability and harmonious relationships with their families and communities. But for a spiritual practitioner, on top of these mundane objectives, there are additional goals, and in order to achieve those ends, one requires a specific set of skills and also insight. Now, although many claim that all religions and spiritual paths are essentially the same, this is clearly not the case. But this doesn't mean that one path is essentially better than another. The question is not which is the best religion, but rather which tradition is most suitable for my particular set of aims and objectives. The danger here is that one will apply oneself to an erroneous path that is predicated on a false pretext for practice. That is, a path that leads to results other than those one intends to pursue. But don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily the case that such a practice will only bring about negative results. Because if out of blind faith you apply yourself to a virtuous path, there is a good chance you will achieve some positive, albeit potentially temporary, results. For example, if one has faith in God, and because of this conducts oneself virtuously, and also avoids negative actions, things will almost certainly turn out for the better. However, if one blindly follows a mistaken path, it is quite likely that the outcomes will be negative and harmful to oneself and others. For example, there is the story of Angulimala, who was commanded by his teacher to kill 1,000 people. But there is another danger here, and that is, if you apply yourself to methods that are essentially contradictory to achieving your own stated objectives, not only will you not achieve your goals, but you will also waste a lot of time and energy in the process. For example, it won't be of any use to you to study the Hindi alphabet if your objective is to learn Mandarin Chinese. Well, there are many different reasons for practicing the spiritual path, and not all of them are concerned with transcendence. In fact, most people practice merely to experience greater well-being and happiness in their life, or to reduce anxiety and overcome past trauma. And you might very well ask, is this a valid reason for practicing the Dharma? Well, the Buddha taught 3 valid reasons for practicing the path, and those are 1. Seeking higher rebirth, 2. Seeking liberation from the mundane world, and 3. Achieving Buddhahood for the sake of all other sentient beings. And also, the Buddha taught 3 valid reasons for practicing discipline, those being 1. Seeking protection from fear, 2. Seeking higher rebirth, and 3. Seeking liberation. And so, as you can see here, there are a variety of valid reasons for the practice. But it is also important to understand that not all techniques are necessarily suitable for your own chosen aims and objectives. For example, if you want to sail across the ocean, it is totally unnecessary to build a rocket ship capable of achieving orbital velocity. What you need to do is to build a sailboat. Likewise, if you are merely seeking some positive psychological transformation, the methods taught in the Vajrayana, intended for achieving final awakening in a single lifetime, are totally over the top. In fact, using these techniques would ultimately be counterproductive to your aims and objectives. Because, in the short term at least, practicing like this would almost certainly increase your mundane suffering and not reduce it. And so, the point here is that if you want to practice effectively on the spiritual path, the first thing you need to do is a bit of your own research. And this doesn't only mean studying the Buddha Dharma. In fact, rather than being told to shun all other religions, Buddhists are encouraged to study them in order to gain clarity on their respective qualities and what makes them unique in terms of view, conduct, and meditation. So in general, there are 3 activities that any spiritual practitioner needs to engage in, and those are study, contemplation, and meditation. And as a beginner on the path, the first and most important thing to do is to study. You need to do some personal research in order to understand exactly what is being taught. But also, you need to check out your teacher before you decide to become their student. It is taught that the student not checking out the potential teacher before relying on them is like drinking poison. And the teacher not checking out the student before accepting them is like jumping off a cliff. Often what happens is we are all too eager to adopt a spiritual practice before we actually understand anything about the philosophical view and commitments we are expected to uphold associated with that tradition. And the danger of approaching the spiritual path in this manner is that we will end up spending a lot of time and energy going around in circles and never actually getting anywhere. And this is especially the case for those who are convinced that they have sufficient wisdom and experience to figure out the existential paradox of the universe all by themselves, without having to rely on the received wisdom of the masters of the past. The basic concept is that using the various source materials available, that one can pick and choose whichever ideas resonate most with one's own natural outlook, and by this contrive one's own personal spiritual path. In spiritual terms, this is like living in a social media echo chamber, because by this one merely reinforces one's own preferences and prejudices. The entire point of the spiritual path is to fundamentally change one's outlook, and not merely to reinforce it. Because, since beginningless time, we have been wandering around in samsara, and up until now have never been able to escape the relentless cycle of suffering that is the mundane world. In order to transcend the world, you need to overcome your worldly ways of thinking. However, if you have already realized the ultimate meaning of life, then what need would there be to practice the spiritual path? So as a beginner, your first task is to figure out what it is you wish to accomplish from your practice. And in order to do that, at very least, you have to have a basic understanding of what your own first principles are. That is to say, the basic underlying assumptions that you make about reality. And so, for example, the goal of liberation, as it is taught in the Buddha Dharma, is predicated upon the notion that there is actually something called transcendence from suffering, and also that there is something called karma, cause and effect, and past and future lives. Furthermore, To understand these principal assumptions, one also has to have a basic working knowledge of the terminology used. So, for example, if you say you want to seek liberation from samsara, then you need to have at least a basic understanding of what these terms liberation and samsara mean. And if you yourself are unclear about what these terms are referring to, or otherwise become unstuck when you try to explain them to another, this is a sign that there is an internal conflict in your pretext for practice. That means a dissonance between your stated aims and objectives and your fundamental beliefs and understanding. But there is another important point here, and that is your natural view will evolve over time on the basis of these activities of study, contemplation, and meditation. So it's not as if you need to completely grasp the path in its entirety from the outset. But before you can actually begin to practice, you do, however, have to have a basic understanding of what you are doing, and also what you expect to achieve from your practice. And so, for example, when you use the term awakening, you should ask yourself, is this the awakening that is referred to in one of the many ancient spiritual traditions? Or is this awakening something else, something personal to me that I define on my own terms? What is abundantly clear is that most people who claim to be awakened these days are talking about this latter type of awakening. Many people, like Daniel Ingram for instance, claim to have attained the state of an Arhat. And yet, at the same time, they do not seem to possess any of the qualities associated with this attainment. And when you ask them why this is, they almost invariably reply that these ancient accounts of sages with miraculous powers are fictitious and hyperbolic. But this only shows that the awakening they are talking about is one that they define in their own terms, and not the awakening that is talked about in the Buddha's teachings. And furthermore, if these accounts are merely fictitious, does this mean that there are no special qualities associated with spiritual realization? I mean, aside from just feeling better about oneself or feeling more chilled out. Well, it seems that some advanced Hindu practitioners do obtain special abilities through their practice. And this is a well-documented phenomena. For example, they can undergo invasive surgery without needing an anesthetic, solely based on their meditative equipoise, or even walk across roasting hot coals without getting burnt. But for example, if the doctor said, "Hey Daniel, is it okay if I take out your appendix without using an anesthetic?" he would almost certainly reply, "Of course not. Are you effing crazy or something?" But believe it or not, these seemingly supernatural abilities are what we call worldly attainments, and not transcendent ones. And so, if someone like Daniel Ingram claims to have achieved arhatship, a state that by definition transcends all mundane suffering, yet at the same time does not demonstrate any signs of success in his practice, then the question that begs to be asked is, what is the basis or proof of these claims? Now, the usual response is often simply this: well, I used to experience a lot of trauma and anxiety, and now I feel much better. But this is what we call positive psychological transformation, and really has nothing to do with what we call transcendence or awakening. And forget about miraculous powers. To put it simply, an Arhat, as it's taught in the Buddha Dharma, is someone who has completely eradicated their mind poisons. Basically, that means they would never get upset or experience negative emotions such as craving, jealousy, or pride, etc. They would also never experience laziness or doubt, for instance. But I am pretty certain that Daniel does have attachment, aversion, pride, etc., and also experiences suffering. In fact, if he watches this video, it is quite possible that what I have said might trigger him in some way. But this would never be the case for an Arhat who has completely conquered their mind poisons. In fact, the term Arhat in Tibetan literally means foe destroyer, and that refers to someone who has totally conquered the demon of the afflictions. And furthermore, the state of an Arhat is what is called the final result of the 4 results of a bhikkhu, or the 4 results of a fully ordained monk or nun. And in the Buddhist scheme of things, that means that only a fully ordained monk or nun is able to become an Arhat. Yet at the same time, many Westerners, lay practitioners, who have never been ordained and likewise have no plan to take monastic vows, also claim to have achieved the state of an Arhat, or likewise one of the other three results, those being the result of a stream enterer, the result of a once returner, and the result of a non-returner. So by this, you can see clearly that what they are talking about is not the state of an Arhat as is defined in the Buddha's teachings, but something else that they are defining on their own terms. And don't get me wrong, I have absolutely no problem with that. If someone wants to claim that they are the President of the United States of America, and by President they mean anyone working in the government, no matter how minor their role, then that is their prerogative. But it's going to be a hell of a lot easier if they clarify exactly what they mean by President. That is, if they want to avoid misunderstanding, or otherwise avoid being labeled a lunatic. But I have to be honest with you here. Whenever a Westerner claims that they are an Arhat, or likewise claims that they are enlightened, those who know better, and by that I mean those who have spent their entire lives practicing and studying the Dharma, well, those people will usually smile uncomfortably, thinking, the poor fellow is completely deluded. And that's because they understand how incredibly difficult it is to achieve awakening. And it is my sincere wish that you should practice the path, and by that achieve liberation from suffering in the mundane world, and eventually attain final awakening, solely for the benefit of all other sentient beings. I only hope that these hard truths have not been too hard to swallow, and that something I have said may be of benefit to you as you embark upon this most sublime of spiritual journeys. So until next time, good luck with your practice, and see you later.